Hi, my name is Girish Daswani. Welcome to the Everyday Orientalism podcast series. We're here to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Everyday Orientalism, a public platform through which students, academics, and citizens reflect on how history and power shape the ways in which human societies define themselves. The platform foregrounds the histories and political struggles that those in power often seek to erase. Defined by Palestinian-American literary scholar Edward Said, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Featuring a stellar lineup of guests, we explore how Orientalism continues to have deep ramifications in our everyday lives, for how we think about settler colonialism, liberation, and how empire and capitalism continue to exploit and dehumanize the majority of us. In May 2026, the University of Toronto sponsored CanSec, a Canadian Security and Defence conference held in Ottawa. This was the first time that a university had contributed to a military conference that sold weapons of war used in genocides around the world. U of T's investment in CanSec was not without controversy or protest. Yet, it was certainly in alignment with its own investments in defence research and innovation, and with the Canadian government's recent increase in military spending. U of T's contribution of $10,300 is consistent with its continued refusal to divest from the military-industrial complex. For example, the University of Toronto's Asset Management Corporation, or UTEM, employs external investment managers that continue to profit from the defense sector. These include investments in multiple companies and weapon manufacturers like Elbit Systems, Lockheed Martin, and Palantir Technologies. Companies named in UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese's report as complicit in the genocide in Palestine. Such financial investments in war, death, and genocide speak to the ways in which universities have become extensions of capital and how they hierarchically value life. Universities in the US and in Canada exemplify white supremacist and settler colonial values that profit from the disposability of life in the non-Western world. Beholden to financial donors and private investments, they remind us that the status of non-human that makes brown, black, and Muslim bodies disposable and expendable is not limited to an elsewhere, but located within the university. Rather than encouraging intellectuals to question institutions that enable the murder of innocents, students and faculty are informed that they should not criticize Israel. They have used this same Israeli exceptionalism to create a stranglehold on academic freedom and freedom of speech on campuses. Sadly, this is part of a larger problem. In a recent speech on June 1, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced measures to combat anti-Semitism, to quote him, across public institutions, workplaces, campuses, and online spaces. He said this without breathing a word about the genocide in Palestine, nor the decimation of land and lives in Lebanon, of which Israel is the colonizer and aggressor. Nothing was said about the visible rise in anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia that we are witnessing in North America, in the UK, and across Europe and Australia. Not a whisper from Carney about how Israel's genocidal murder of Palestinians and Lebanese and its problematic conflation of Zionism with Judaism might actually be contributing to the conditions for anti-Semitism. Alongside an Israeli exceptionalism, the faculty, students, and staff of universities have been subject to the conditions of containment and censorship around matters relating to Palestine. This Palestine exception commits a settler colonial harm through the active suppression of Palestinian rights and advocacy. It carries with it certain assumptions. For example, that Palestinian histories and national struggles are undeserving of recognition, and that any criticism of Israel is unacceptable or anti-Semitic and cannot be compared to other colonial and settler colonial contexts. Using a language of civility and neutrality, universities have created what George Orwell has called a political language that, to quote him, is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. We are in the midst of an unprecedented assault on free speech and academic freedom that we've not seen since the McCarthyism of the 1950s. We've been told that the danger comes from the left, student activists, outspoken academics, and the disgruntled youth who oppose a genocide. Yet, the actual campaigns to police speech in public institutions come from university administrations and nation-states that condone and participate in a genocide. Today, we are joined by three scholars to speak on these questions of academic freedom and the university. Nathan Kalman-Lamb is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of New Brunswick, where he teaches on social theory and the sociology of sport. He's co-host of the End of Sport podcast and co-author of The End of College Football on the human cost of an All-American game, published by UNC Press in 2024. Muhannad Ayyash was born and raised in Silwan, Al-Quds before immigrating to Canada, where he is a professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He is also a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. He's the author of Lordship and Liberation in Palestine, Israel, published by Columbia University Press in 2025, and A Hermeneutics of Violence, published by University of Toronto Press 2019. Heidi Matthews is Assistant Professor of Law at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. She researches and teaches in the areas of international criminal law, the law of war, international legal history, and political theory. Her work theorizes contemporary shifts in the practice and discourse of the global legal regulation of political violence. Welcome, everyone. That was a long introduction, but I wanted to say I'm very happy to have you here.
Thanks for the invite to be here. It's great to be with everyone.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to share this space with you all here this morning.
So, can you share with us some of your experiences on academic freedom and free speech on campuses, especially since October 7th? Have you noticed any changes, and how have these changes affected you personally? Perhaps we can start with Muhannad and go to Nathan and then to Heidi.
How I always like to think about it is that, universities are not universal. The experience in a big university is not going to be the same as it is in a small university. And even within a university, there's going to be differences depending on the department that you're in. So, let's just do away with all the pretense. There is such a thing as the pro-Israel lobby. It works very closely to monitor, censor, and marginalize what I have called in one of my articles, the Palestinian critique of Zionism in Israel. And the Palestinian critique of Zionism in Israel is essentially any critique that centralizes the Palestinian experience of the Zionist project and the emergence of the Israeli state, its establishment, and its continuing violences from the early parts of the 20th century until today. Essentially, it's a critique that highlights the experience of genocide, of those who are fated and destined for elimination and their destruction. Israel does not tolerate that kind of critique, does not want the reality of the Zionist project and the reality of the Israeli state to be part of the conversation, the open public conversation, in especially Western spaces, but indeed across the world, but especially in Western spaces, because they're entirely dependent on unconditional Western support, starting with the British Empire and then the American Empire. So whenever you experience anything on a Canadian campus, know that it's not some kind of isolated, individualized experience of censorship or an attack on academic freedom. It is part and parcel of this larger Israeli state project to eliminate the Palestinian question once and for all. They don't want something called Palestine to exist as a sovereign entity, and therefore they don't want Palestinians to exist as a political subject in history. And if your work is promoting that, is revealing the reality on the ground, then they're going to attack it. Now, they don't have infinite resources. So they direct their resources towards areas that they think are most influential. That tend to be departments of law, economics, health, journalism. I would say they even probably prioritize art over disciplines like mine, sociology, anthropology. And the bigger the university, the more influential the department, the more there's going to be censorship and marginalization and so on. So when you're asking me about my personal experience, it's no coincidence that it actually comes up most when I give a talk at York, as opposed to my own university. Now, there's been attempts to silence me at my university and so on and so forth, but they've not worked. I'm actually lucky that my university has never come to me and said, we're canceling your talk, or, hey, you can't go publish in Al Jazeera like you do. They get complaints all the time, trust me. But they've never actually come and said anything to me about this work. And I consider myself extremely lucky for that. that have a very supportive department, especially, and a very supportive dean. But the university as a whole has never done that. But at York, I go to give a talk in 2024 and cops show up, to investigate this event. Because it's a bigger university. It's a, bigger space. It's Toronto and so on and so forth. So that happened in 2024. There's been other stories, but that's the one that always stands out, of course. And of course, it didn't affect me. I wasn't going to be intimidated by something as silly as a couple of cops showing up to investigate my talk, which is really laughable if it wasn't part of such a larger structural violence. The whole point of doing something like that is to intimidate, is to say that the kind of work that this person is presenting, even though it doesn't affect me personally, I was not charged, the event didn't get canceled. I went out and talked as usual. I invited them to stay so that they could learn something real for a change. But the point of it is to say this research that this person is presenting is dangerous. It warrants a close surveillance by the state. The state needs to pay attention to what he's saying because it could be potentially illegal even, not just harmful and quote unquote threatening to community safety and all those sorts of things, but could also be illegal. And the state is watching anyone who's doing this work, and it's watching with its police force. And it doesn't care that you're on the university campus. It will come on there and watch it. So that's kind of the message. And it can be deterring to people in more precarious employment, to undergraduates, to graduate students. That this is the message. And as well, that's the message that gets out to the public, that anyone who's doing this is really subject to state surveillance. And therefore, you should watch out and not really do this. So to me, it's not about me personally, because I'm fine. Nothing is happening to me that is remotely close to anything going on in Palestine. It's really about that bigger picture of silencing people here for the purpose of continuing the genocide there.
Exactly.
That's to me what we need to keep in mind at all times.
Exactly. I just want to just point out the title of your talk, which created the ruckus of having the police show up: The Palestinian Struggle for Liberation, Aspirations for a Decolonial Life. Now, how scary is that, right? As
terrifying.
A title. Nathan, what about you?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate Muhannad providing all this kind of context for us in terms of like what the picture looks like across the country. And I am also at a smaller institution. So Heidi's going to be the kind of the outlier here in Toronto, kind of like the epicenter, I think, in Canada, right? In terms of where all these tensions are playing out. So me on the opposite of the country in New Brunswick here, we've seen like small manifestations of the larger tensions that are facing everyone in the country. We had an incident where, so I heard, this is a secondhand report, we had an incident where apparently at some kind of alumni of lobster dinner, which is apparently a thing that the president does with alumni here because it's New Brunswick, some students were flyering essentially about Palestine, and the president lost it and was furious, was screaming at them and so forth. We had an incident that has been noted where people were, prohibited from wearing keffiyehs at graduation, which is something we've seen across the country, but even had their bags searched. We literally had, people who were going to be in the audience having their bags just in case someone was smuggling them in to the facility, The person hasn't wanted to come public with this, but I've heard of a staff member at one institution in Canada who literally was fired for wearing a keffiyeh at a formal event. So, this is something that people are facing across the country. And I would actually point people to the incredible report, Palestine at Canadian Universities, which is an exceptionally comprehensive rundown of all of the different forms of harm people have been subjected to for simply saying that genocide is wrong. And it also really itemizes the levels of institutional complicity with the genocide. So it's a really important report. It's a qualitative reading. So they did well over 100 interviews with folks across the country about their experiences. Another thing that happened, this was again in Toronto, but we know that there was an incident at the Indigo in Toronto, very near the beginning of not long after October 7th, where, some red paint was splashed, from my recollection, red paint was splashed on Indigo or something like that. Yeah. And the Toronto police arrested a number of people as a consequence. And one of them was York University sociology professor Leslie Wood. And sociology departments across the country were asked to sign a letter of support. The International Sociology Association signed a letter of support. The Canadian Sociology Association signed a letter of support. My department did not sign a letter of support. So just to sort of speak to what these tensions look like right across the country, that's another example. And the last thing I'll say right now, just to give a picture, because again, like Muhannad, I don't feel that I've been personally harmed in any real significant way. But, I did sign a statement of support online for the University of Toronto anti-genocide encampment. And I have so much profound admiration for the students across North America, around the world, who really put this on the public agenda in a way that up to that moment, of course, like the genocide was horrific, but North America had largely evaded a serious public conversation about it, I think, until the student anti-genocide encampments thrust that center stage. And then they became the controversy. But in doing so, they constantly bring the messaging back to the real harm that was occurring in Palestine and in Gaza. Anyway, so out of my deep admiration, I was like, I'm an alumnus of the University of Toronto. I'd be thrilled to say that I support this encampment. And because of that, I was listed on Canary Mission. And because I was listed on Canary Mission, I was then denied entry into the United States in January of 2025. So, this speaks to the larger point we're making, that there are ways in which people feel some kind of backlash when you speak the truth. But like Muhannad said, it pales in comparison to the amount of harm done, and it's well worth speaking. I mean, I would never second guess for a moment my decision to speak, and I'll speak, and I keep speaking. What my decision was okay, I guess I'm not going back to the United States, but I'm going to speak 5 times as loud now that I've decided not to go back to the United States.
That's interesting because, it actually is not common. I think what we have here, the three of you speaking up and speaking out about the genocide in Palestine and still continuing to speak up, even though through different forms of intimidation and censorship, is actually still less common than we would like it to be. Heidi, so I know that you too have faced kind of accusations from, let's say, Hillel, Ontario, and you've had backlash too. I mean, how has it been for you in terms of your work and your advocacy?
Yeah, so just to start, I do hesitate to kind of, I know the question is posed to me about my experience, et cetera, and it's all very important, but I do want to preface any response just by saying that, as the other guests have already mentioned, whatever repression we're facing in the West or North America or Canada pales in comparison to the genocide, and in particular, the structures of educational destruction, both in terms of educational presence and futures in Palestine. Sometimes we talk about that in terms of scholasticide as a particular form of destruction within the overall genocidal context. That's not a new term. I'm sure many of your listeners will know. Kalman-Lamb coined it, I think almost 20 years ago, to talk about the ways in which knowledge itself, right, and the production of knowledge has been central as a target for the occupation and genocidal practices within the occupation for reasons that should be clear. And so that's why, right, targeting education outside of Israel is also very, very important for the state in its pursuit of, again, its unlawful occupation and support for the unlawful occupation more broadly, and then particular genocidal practices. But I think all of that to say, though, that there is this through line, and Muhannad put this so nicely just now, right, that any instance of repression that we see, particularly around freedom of speech and more directly academic freedom in the educational context, is directly tied to the genocide, right? And I think that's difficult for folks to parse sometimes because, university administrators, I don't think they think of themselves, they don't have genocidal intent, right? That's not what we're seeing, right? They don't think of themselves as actively participating in a project aimed at the destruction of a group in whole or in part, right? Like that's not how they see themselves. But structurally, the design of the thing is to perpetuate the acceptance of the notion that furthering spurious conceptions, let's just say, of anti-Semitism on campus, right, which have been central to the repression policies, that furthering all of that is actually divorced from the broader genocidal project and is somehow, immunized or is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. And you mentioned this in the introduction, this notion of institutional neutrality has been really important here, right? So institutions and administrators want to think of themselves as, in fact, doing the right thing, right? So maybe their commitments, and I'm thinking of my own institution here, but this applies more broadly, previous commitments to more full-throated conceptions of things like social justice, right, might actually have been misguided. Maybe those ideas can kind of smuggle in ideas or projects that fulsomely critique political Zionism that actually, maybe are harmful to Jewish students or whatever. So this is kind of the discourse, I think, that holds it all together. And I want to be clear that at the same time that our administrators don't see themselves as genocidal, right, we need to kind of constantly resurface the way in which these various oppressive tactics actually do function within that broader social and political project. And that's, I mean, I think would be, that's actually the work that I see as having been less fulsomely done to date. I think part of that is just because those who are active within the academy contesting the genocide are exhausted and completely stretched in terms of their resources as well, right? So even getting to that point of doing the analytical work to show people how this functions in society is actually kind of beyond the scope. And I think so that's kind of the second part of what I'll say. So part of the design, tactically, right, is to not just have people fired or disciplined or expressly knuckle wrapped for their rhetoric or their teaching or their activism or whatever, right? It's actually to just whittle us down. So to make us so completely consumed on a daily basis by various kinds of stressors and pressures that it's actually impossible to do our work properly within the context that we're given, right? So you might think of that as creating a hostile work environment, right? That's kind of the legal terminology that sometimes goes along with this in employment and labor law framework. But drawing out those connections is not as obvious as we might think. So I think it's really important, as has been done, to point out instances where, for example, wearing a keffiyeh is, expressly disciplined in one way or another, or police show up at a talk. I mean, heinous and obvious, discriminatory and disgusting in so many obvious ways, right? But there are so many other less obvious, more coded forms of pressure and repression that kind of fly under the radar and don't, I think, necessarily get recognized as such unless you tell them as part of a much broader kind of packaged narrative. And all of those things taken together, as I said before, are designed actually, I think, to just wear us down, not only to chill our speech. I mean, those of us who are very active in this space, are not going to be chilled, right? There's that ship has sailed. Obviously, the project is to chill everybody else's speech. But for those who are active either publicly or maybe in a less public way, even just in terms of providing student support, right? Which is a hugely taxing endeavor. This kind of, service work falls disproportionately on racialized faculty, on women faculty. I wouldn't necessarily have thought of myself as being in a advisory position to Muslim student organizations, right? But here we are. And all of that is an incredible amount of work that is created by the broader structures of repression that both goes kind of unrecognized, but also takes up our time and resources. That is not a complaint at all about any of that very important work that we do, which is both supportive on one hand and also on the other hand, responsive to concrete attacks. But just to say that it's actually almost impossible to be an academic today in Canada or North America who is active in this space, who is able to fully not just address the attacks themselves, but to just operate in a way that is good and healthy and has anything to do with well-being. And so I haven't really talked about specific instances, which I'm happy to do, but I just want to kind of bring in that much broader structure because, we've been in this fight with the intensification of the genocide, right? The fight is much longer, obviously, but with the intensification for so long and it's not going away, right? That resources are depleted. And again, that burden will obviously fall disproportionately on more vulnerable faculty members. So I just wanted to kind of introduce that broader context.
No, that's great. That's
at
great.
The beginning of the conversation.
I mean, things have obviously shifted or changed significantly since October 7th. And again, this is not something new, that there has been the suppression of speech around Palestine or activism around Palestine for many, many years before that. But there has been a significant felt difference. And so this is when I think further structural questions, as has been raised, become really important for us to think about. One of them being the financial investments in the military-industrial complex that universities, whether indirectly or directly, are a part of, and also donor money that also have a very strong influence on the policies, especially donor money that comes from, let's say, Zionist-leaning groups. And so what are some of the connections that you see are being made more apparent now than in the past? Because I think more and more people are seeing things that they didn't see before, even though the problem has always been there. And one of the problems, as I said in my introduction, one of the questions is that how the university has been completely captured by capital in ways that no longer allow it to exist outside of this idea of the relationship between capital and death. And the death of whom? The death of mainly brown, black, Muslim bodies, not just in the non-Western world, but also in the Western world. So I'm just asking you perhaps a very difficult question, but a question that's really, really important. If things have changed more recently, what are we seeing now? And what are some of the connections that we can make more easily now than we could a few years ago?
I mean, I think you're right, first of all, that in the last, not just 2.5 years of the genocide, but the last, I'd say, decade or so, there's just been a lot more attention. And I think that's largely thanks due to the proliferation of mediums for sharing knowledge and circulating knowledge and cultivating knowledge, where people can bypass mainstream media, mainstream discourse, and so on. But there's been a lot of interest and a lot of talk about how elites and money of the elites is ruining everything for everyone, and not just the university, but politics. How much do they talk about, especially in the US, about money in politics, right? They're taking away our democracy, money in politics. Same thing with the universities. And people are just more aware of how elites use their money to advance their own interests at the expense of the many. And I think you're right that it has become more apparent that this is a big problem facing faculty and students within universities. We've become less and less funded by the public sector and more dependent on donor money. And donor money never comes free. It's not just donations. The rich people don't just give money because it's the right thing to do. They give money expecting certain things in return. And not just their own self-aggrandizement, but the pushing forward of their own political agendas, which largely do have to do with the maintenance and expansion of neoliberal capital, along with other political agendas, such as, for example, Zionism and support for the Israeli state and so on. So now we're as academics, okay, so we always should have a holistic understanding of how the neoliberalization of the university will have detrimental effects on our ability to do research, what we teach, how we teach, and so on. But let's kind of parse it out for a minute. Okay, so we have the financial side of things, the financial structures of the universities, and then there's what the university was meant to be, how we would like to think of the university as a space for cultivating knowledge, producing knowledge, pushing the limits on what is possible, challenging status quo power relations. This is how I understood the university and why I got into this in the first place. Now, to me, that space of doing that substantive work, it's still there. It's not dead. So let's not also make people hopeless and drive them into despair. It's still there. We're still able to do that work. It's marginalized, it's censored, it's belittled, all of those things. We understand that. But you can still do that work and it can still have its influence. I totally agree with what Heidi said, in that, they get you so busy protecting yourself and your community, and especially students, vulnerable students, that you don't have time to do that substantive work. I've always just maintained that's not an option for me. I have to do the substantive work no matter what. I gotta just develop certain skills of shutting it out and finding that amount of time I need. And also working at a small university many, many years ago, I was I don't have the luxury of, I need 6 hours straight of no interruptions to write a paper. No, I have to work in 20-minute segments if I need to. I just have to do that because I have a high teaching load, et cetera, a lot of service. So to me, it's just find a solution, find a way to train yourself to continue doing that substantive work. Because the minute that all we do is fight them and not produce a substantive work, what are we fighting for at that point? Then we're trying to just change the structure of this university that it's probably not going to change. So I've never had illusions about the university as a social institution that is largely conservative. I'm not talking about politically conservative, but it's conservative in the sense that it exists within status quo power relations. And its purpose is to promote those. It's not to really challenge them. And if administrators step out of that position, they're taking out. I'm sort of finding myself a little bit all over the place, but let me go back to a quote from our former president at my university. He had a meeting to talk to us, and I forget what the actual topic was, but I think it was about budget and things of that sort. And, the faculty was pushing hard from sort of a more radical perspective, social justice perspective. And he said something that upset a lot of scholars from that side of the political spectrum, but which I thought was actually refreshingly honest on his part. And he said, look, it's not that I disagree with what you're all saying in substance, but if I sounded like you, I would have never gotten this job. And people were like, how dare you say that? I'm like, actually, that's honest. He just said the truth. He just told us exactly what things look like on the inside. If he sounded like us, he would have never gotten this job. I mean, why do presidents get paid so much? It's to kind of attract a certain personality that will say, I want that large salary to not rock the boat too much.
Absolutely.
And they know what they need to sound like in order to fit within that space. So to me, ultimately, it's, we can't expect too much in terms of what are we going to do to radically transform the university. I think other structures need to radically transform. Like the university is not going to transform first before capitalism does or our politics does. It's not that brave as an institution, and it never will be. So I think we keep doing the substantive work and doing work outside the university to try to force that more radical change and deal with these issues of that influence of neoliberalism and the elites.
I completely agree with you that the university is not going to change in its internal hierarchies and structures. But what's interesting, and maybe Nathan can also expand on this or give his thoughts on this, is that something has shifted in the perception of the university. Even if the university itself has a very conservative set of values that it's built upon, even though the university actually was built around the humanities and now it's been taken over by, all these technological and management and AI focus. And the perception is it no longer cares, because the whole idea is that the university projects itself as a space of not just institutional learning and higher education, but of care for knowledge, for students, for faculty. And they actually use that word. This is not even just me saying that. They actually use that word in their own promotional material. Things like DEI, things like indigenization, decolonization. These are phrases that they've used over and over again. And yet now it's almost as if the truth has been revealed in ways that all these things cannot and will never actually matter, because the university is not just allowing for debate and for controversial questions to be raised. They are actively investing and participating in war and genocides. I think that something has shifted in the perception of the university. And this is how I feel, that there is a difference. So Nathan, do you think there is a difference, or maybe I'm just thinking this out too much?
That's exactly what I want to do, is sort of reflect a little bit on change over a couple of decades here. But before I get into that, I think just to highlight these sort of institutional complicities in this moment so that folks understand some of these numbers, right? And this goes back to that Palestine and Canadian Universities report that I mentioned. And by the way, that report makes clear a very large number of Canadian universities have not disclosed. That's why disclosure is one of the demands of this movement. Okay. So and when I say a lot of large universities, York, TMU, U of T, University of Ottawa, Université de Montréal, none of these massive institutions have even disclosed. So the numbers I'm about to give don't include those institutions' investments, okay? But nonetheless, disclosed Canadian universities have at least $1 billion invested in the apparatus of genocide, okay? So that's a horrifically large number, given that these are, as you pointed out, institutions that are putatively devoted to care, knowledge production, right? Nurturing, learning, and they're actively involved in this way, like directly implicated. And let's call out a few of these institutions specifically, because they should be shamed for it. Queen's University, $222 million. University of Manitoba, $155 million. University of Alberta, $130. UBC, $113. So those are just the few that are over $100 million of investments, right? They're playing a very active role. But no, the point I want to make in terms of time is that I sort of was reflecting a little bit on when I was in grad school, and even as an undergraduate student. This is really in the 2000s, especially when I was in grad school at York. And at that time, it's interesting because I think that York, in the moment, I'm talking about the mid to late 2000s into the 2010s, York was a huge outlier in some respects in Canada and in North America, because a lot of the things that are front and center in our kind of higher education politics today, those were our politics at York at that time, when they weren't really being fought over in a lot of other places, right? So we had war over Israel Apartheid Week. This was a huge conflict at York at that time. We struck twice in my time that was there. And we're talking about strikes of 2 to 3 months long strikes where you actually shut down the university. And we could shut down the university because more than 50% of all teaching at York was done by people who were in the contingent faculty ranks, graduate students and contingent faculty. So we didn't need UFA, which is the faculty union, to align with us in order to shut down the university. We did enough of the teaching that we could shut down the university, right? So you could see already the way in which we had the precaritization of higher education, this kind of neoliberal university, the way it was, everything that you've been describing, right? Like the fact that this imbrication of capital and higher education, it was clear as day. In fact, we understood that the York University administration had hired an enormous fleet of union-busting lawyers who we were in war with. And we were just fighting. We struck for 3 months so that we wouldn't lose the gains that had been made by people in our union previously. We weren't gaining anything. We were on strike for big gains. We were on strike just not to have a concessionary offer, right? There were not very many universities going on strike at this time in Canada, and there were almost none in the United States. And this is going to sound weird to people who are kind of like a little bit younger than I am. They're like, oh, we've been talking for like well over a decade about the unionization of graduate students. Graduate student labor struggles have been at the forefront of the conversation of higher education in the United States. And that's true, but that happened afterwards. And that's what I'm trying to get at is actually like we're in this moment where the contradictions have been heightening. And so in this dialectical way, like normally I'm the pessimist. I don't really like to take a sort of an optimistic spin on anything or to try to do that academic move where you're like, well, where do we see hope in this, right? I tend not to see the hope. But kind of in this conversation, honestly, based on my own experience, I do see it in a way because I feel like all of North American higher education has become York University when I was in graduate school, right? The things we were fighting over, those are the things we're now fighting over in encampments in Alberta. The fact that the police had to get called in at University of Alberta, Calgary, to shut down anti-genocide encampments, to me that seems like a massive win because Alberta is not exactly at the forefront of radical left politics in Canada. In the same way, we saw the same thing at University of Texas, Austin, right? In the US, right? In Texas, the police were in there, the state troopers or whatever you call them, right? Were brutalizing students, but they had to because that's how vivacious the student movement for Palestine had become. Right. And we're fighting these cuts in higher education across the board. Now, one of the trends we've seen. So like one of the really harmful things for higher education has been that the lack of public funding. Obviously, that's what's thrown Canadian universities into crisis across the board. And we all know that Canadian universities have then leaned into the recruiting of international students, right, to fill that gap. And the reason why we have this like acute crisis now at Canadian universities is because then the federal government prevented the ability to recruit international students. And then it was like, well, there's no funding at all. But we got to remember a couple things. One, this recruitment of international students is unbelievably exploitative in its own right? I mean, this is like predatory recruitment straight up because they're paying much higher tuition fees. It's completely unjust if we don't understand borders to be legitimate constructs, right? It's just like profoundly unjust. But if we're thinking dialectically in terms of the contradiction, what we have actually done then is recruited people from around the world who are actually a lot more sensitive than a lot of folks in North America who are kind of like, let's face it, like stupefied to a certain extent by the spectacle of late capitalism and therefore are not necessarily always invested in political issues around the world. But international students are much more connected to the struggles of the world, and they bring those struggles, and it's a wonderful resource, is what I'm trying to say, for us on our campuses to see this attentiveness to the world outside of Canada. So that predatory recruitment, which is a capitalist project, really, has actually led to this contradiction for universities where now we're fighting against our own students because they actually don't think it's appropriate for us to be investing in genocidal companies. And actually, they disagree even with the predatory recruitment of other international students because they're arguing that it's exploitative, which they're right to argue. And then I think that more broadly outside of the university, what you're also pointing to is we've seen, especially on the issue of Palestine, right? Because there's been a lot of defeats and we cannot minimize just the harm is horrific. But if there is a victory, the victory is popular sentiment in the world. And we have to understand it on that scale is just night and day from what it was on October 6th, 2023. We are now in a moment where the four of us in this conversation might say, well, saying this stuff on our university campuses, it's not great for our like job security or for like being loved by our administrators or whatever. That's objectively true, obviously. But honestly, on Twitter, they love us. Because the truth is that like that's actually what the world wants to hear. People are like thirsty for the truth. We did some brief organizing around the Davis Cup match in Halifax when Israel was to play Canada. And so we had some successes. We got the fans kicked out of the stadium, which was a win. But at one point, because of that, Global TV News wanted to interview me to talk about it. And I said genocide like 15 times in this brief conversation because, I was like making a point. That was my talking point. And the thing was, like, I put it on TikTok after, and it was like the most viral thing I ever put on TikTok because people were like, I can't believe a person is saying genocide on Canadian television. Like, thank goodness. We've been waiting to just hear the word. Stop gaslighting us and tell us the truth. And it is a victory that that's our broader climate because that creates the potential for us to have more victories.
Let's hear from you, Heidi. Do you have hope for where the university is now in terms of thinking through the corporatization of the university? Or would you have any thoughts to add to what has been said?
I do, yeah. And I just want to clarify, I wasn't in any way suggesting that we stop doing the substantive work, analyzing the genocide earlier, but just to say that it's intentional within the structure of the various pieces that go into an overall repressive strategy with respect to academic freedom, that our lives are made as difficult as humanly possible with the ultimate view to suppressing that work, which of course will never be suppressed, right? And that we continue to do. So just to be really clear about that, it's just, we're not able to work in any kind of normal or healthy fashion. I think oftentimes people think about academics as having these like plush jobs, right? Or whatever, where we're just kind of like sitting around and dreaming as opposed to spending, 6 hours a day emailing plus teaching plus writing. I don't know. I struggle with the hope question because I'm very much convinced that generally, but specifically within the context of higher education, that as not only the genocide in Palestine, but the aggressive wars throughout the region, particularly Lebanon and Iran that we're witnessing, all of that, it's intensifying over the last 24 hours, but all of that is intensifying and will get much worse before it gets better. And that will have repercussions at home as well. So I agree very much with everything that's been said, but it's not a linear move. Right. So we're not just kind of getting progressively better and better, and then one day it'll improve. I think the pro-Israel forces, which exist in the private sector, but much in the public sector, and the two cannot be divorced, and I'll talk about that more in a moment, right, are only getting stronger. Israel has been very, very clear about its pressure campaign in the Canadian context about pushing forward perspectives on anti-Semitism that privilege things like the IHRA definition, et cetera, which of course conflate critique of the state with anti-Jewish hatred. Nathan perhaps is in a better position than me to kind of flesh that out a bit. But the state's been very clear about its own lobbying push very recently within Canada. We see that kind of coming to fruition last night with Carney's speech and unveiling of a new strategy, et cetera. It's not just in Canada, right? So this is a coordinated campaign that we see also in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Australia, and all over as well, right? So Canada is kind of one piece of it, but you could actually, trace it as a broader thing. But I am very much convinced that the repression on campus and other sectors of society will only get worse before it ultimately gets better, before the occupation ultimately ends and, we enter some kind of different space. So while there is very significant gains have been made, we can look at, for example, our public broadcaster in Canada, the CBC, is you can say genocide on the CBC. Now, you can say things that again, that's not a linear progress narrative either.
They haven't let me say it yet. Are you sure? Can they let
I say it all the time.
Good for you.
I do. Yeah.
No, when they pre-produce me and I say it, then they don't call me back.
So it depends. So I will say this, it's actually a really individual thing. And this is why it's important to call it individual good actors in the system, whether they're academics or whether they're producers in media institutions or whatever, because there are excellent individual producers. And then there's also a broader, more repressive strategy. But that's just to my point, right? Is that it's not a linear progress narrative and things are going to get much worse before they get better. That's my prediction. I think we're just kind of watching that play out in real time. In terms of the actual kind of the unveiling of donor connections, corporate, but also specifically animated by political Zionist projects, right? What I will say is that process started, just to remind folks, we'll go back, let's say, to 2020 as an arbitrary, but also not so arbitrary point here with the Azarova affair at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, right? Where we have the story that gets unveiled by virtue of faculty whistleblowers who know what's happening and then go public with it, right? Otherwise, it would never have come to light. We have a sitting federal judge who calls the dean and says, we don't want Dr. Azarova hired on the basis of her prior advocacy for Palestinian human rights and et cetera, right? The University of Toronto eventually gets censored by the Canadian Association of University Teachers, and there's a whole saga and an investigation and right? So that was an important turning point because I think it kind of turned the eyes of so to a certain degree publicly, but certainly within academia, started to get folks to be able to talk openly about these pressure points that, again, are just not visible, right? They have to be rendered visible. Disclosure of university investments is a super important way of doing that with respect to, the private sector. But there are also other moments as well. We see 2 or 3 months ago now, the Law Students Association at McGill, the Faculty of Law at McGill University, voted in favor of a BDS motion. That situation is going to get much worse as well, but we have, a donor very publicly withdrawing their donations, that being publicly reported throughout mainstream media, et cetera. So folks are, these pressure points are like more visible, but they're also still happening at the same time. I've requested my university administration to give me disclosure about what actual, specific pressures they've been subjected to, whether that's by the government, whether that's by various lobby groups, whether that's by individual donors, et cetera. Of course, they've refused to do that just voluntarily. So, there's a lot that we don't actually know. I do want to actually just bring it back to kind of my own experience and the connection with the broader political project here too, particularly in Ontario, right, with the government. So it's really important, as much as there's neoliberalization and all of that, right? Provincial governments are not neutral actors with respect, and we know this through the way in which they fund institutions and otherwise pressurize them. So on October 17th, 2023, myself, along with a colleague, Muhannad at University of Toronto Law School, were both publicly named on the floor of the Ontario Parliament by the then Minister of Colleges and Universities. This hasn't happened since the McCarthy era. There was another instance in that time when that happened, but folks have looked into it and they can't seem to have found another moment when parliamentary privilege was used to shield defamatory remarks targeting individual academics, right? The call was for me to be, not just me, my colleague as well, 3 of us, there was another non-law school professor named as well. The call was that we should be disciplined, et cetera. I was accused of justifying and diminishing the murder of Israeli children, Hamas. That's a direct quote from the minister themselves, right? Obviously entirely defamatory. This is not, so the effects of this, so now I don't know what the broader effects of this are in the universe, right? Like this was 2.5 years ago. The purpose of that particular intervention, which is from the government, right, to the university, is to have a concrete material impact on academics who, myself, but the idea is to chill speech among those of us who don't have the job security that's afforded by tenure. And I don't know what the broader story is with respect to government intervention at the university with respect to my own particular case. I may well one day, but right now I don't have a full picture of that. And so there's a lot that I think it remains to be revealed about how these nodes work, what the interrelationships are between the pro-Israel lobby and the government, and then the university, between individual powerful members, for example, of the bar. Like we're talking about certain sectors of education being maybe seen to be more powerful and then more juicier fruit to sort of target for repression. I think law schools in Toronto, by virtue of my own example and the Azarova affair, are perceived at least to be high on that list. And so we don't actually really know what the full picture of all of that is. And I bless the students, right? I agree with you, Nathan. Like, it's great that the state has been forced to, arrest and charge people and engage in various kinds of physical and psychological brutalization. But also, just to bring it back to York, the administration at York was really, I think, emboldened by these repressive tactics. And the encampment at York was up for like 12 hours before the police were called in, right? And so administrations in the state, they learn quickly and they adapt. And so just to temper a little bit kind of that impetus for hope and really say, I think things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. And the full picture is very, very far from being fully known at this point.
Thank you, Heidi. I do remember that incident that you mentioned when the Minister for Education actually mentioned names, including yours, and made certain accusations that clearly was targeting and also harassing and chilling speech, academic speech. And these are exactly as you mentioned, they have a chilling effect. They're also exhausting. on faculty, but I guess also what actually is still helpful or inspiring is the fact that the students continue to be on the front lines of a lot of this. And, perhaps we play supportive roles, or even those of us who are slightly more privileged to have for tenured jobs are perhaps able to put ourselves out there in ways that, will never allow us to be the university president or the head of, some kind of institute or a dean. So how have you changed in response to the events of active suppression of speech, academic freedom being challenged by the university administrators? Has this changed you in some way?
I always am highly uncomfortable with any question about me personally in these times. So I just want to preface it that way because it doesn't matter. Honestly, it just doesn't. What I feel here, it's nothing. It's nothing. Everything goes back to Gaza, to the West Bank. But I will try to answer it in this way. So I grew up in Palestine under Israeli settler colonial occupation. I didn't exactly have any false pretense about what institutions are. I grew up a stateless person. For me, all institutions were designed to eliminate me and my people. It's not some big mystery. Even when we moved to Canada, of course, there's like a little bit of a shine on the place when you first come in here and all of that stuff. But I never had some kind of hope in these institutions that they were different or anything like that. I understood them for what they are. Maybe didn't have the vocabulary and the grammar to talk about it, as a young person and all of that. But I always had that sense of detachment from institutions. And probably that became more detached over the last 2 years. And not just me, many Palestinians in Canada feel the same way. They don't feel attachment at all to Canadian institutions, whether it's the university, the politics, economic institutions, cultural institutions, sports, anything. And you start to always think, like, oh, the first thing you ask is, what are their position on Palestine? I do that with people. Someone invites me to give a talk. The first thing I do is Google them and Palestine, see if they said anything. If they haven't, I don't answer. So I think they just got more intensified, I suppose, but nothing fundamental changed because I never had that attachment to these institutions to begin with. For me, you just have to keep doing the work, regardless of consequences. I do agree with Heidi that things are going to get worse. The state and its institutions have already shown their cards that they're going to intensify. And they've been showing them for a while, by the way, but they're fully out in the open in moments like this. And I think that is leading to a crisis of legitimacy of the state and its institutions on a very drastic scale. So while we sometimes focus on our sort of strategic positionality, and of course we need to do that, and I always do that, and I always bring people back to that if they're not considering that, but also look at the strategic positionality of the other side. These state institutions might get this law passed, this program canceled, this event remolded into something else, this definition of anti-Semitism to pass. And they might look at these as victories that are solidifying their agenda, but they're not really having a sober look at the long-term consequences of what they're doing.
Absolutely.
And the crisis of legitimacy is here, it's real, and it's going to grow. And the more repressive they are, the more that the crisis will accelerate. And whenever you have crisis of legitimacy in state institutions, it has dramatic consequences that nobody here can predict right now. I can't predict them. The state can't predict them. No social scientist or humanities prof can predict them because you don't know how that's going to go. And it can go in multiple directions, not all of them good, by the way. But that there are going to be drastic consequences for this is without question for me. And whenever those consequences come, people will, it could be 30, 40, 50 years down the line, by the way. Even if it's 100 years down the line, the genocide in Gaza will be part of the discourse of that revolutionary moment, whatever way that revolution goes. Even the theorists that understood the crisis of legitimacy as well as anyone, which was Jürgen Habermas, contributed to facilitating that legitimacy crisis. And on a very quick last point, one of the points that I think is also driving this legitimacy crisis is the rise of precarious employment. And I'll just bring one example because it's a large topic, but younger generations have so little to lose by challenging the legitimacy of institutions, precisely because they're not going to be rewarded by the institutions anyway. they're looking at a precarious employment future. They're like, well, what the heck? I might as well say things. We see this in media. So many of the CBC journalists that have blown the whistle, I don't think would have blown the whistle if they had full-time jobs. The ones that have blown the whistle, like there was one that went famous. She was on precarious employment contract. Her contract with CBC ran out, so she blew the whistle. Good for her. She didn't, it's not a guaranteed thing that she would have done that. But if she had a full-time job with benefits and a nice house and mortgage payments and would she have blown the whistle? I don't think a chance in hell she would have. So this precarious employment is also part of the mixture of this crisis of legitimacy that is accelerating and is going to blow up at some point.
Very well said. Thank you, Muhannad.
So, yeah, I just want, I think that Muhannad said it perfectly in terms of, the personal in this larger context, like what the stakes really are here. And actually, you're speaking to your own experience, right? Really, I think, delivers that message more strongly than anything else that I could say, because I have not had those same experiences. That's not where I grew up. I've grown up in Canada. And actually, but I'll connect it to my own, because I think it kind of resonates with what you're saying from a very different angle, right? Which is to say that I'm the descendant, of Holocaust survivors who migrated ultimately to Canada via Hungary, Jews from Hungary who came to Canada in the 50s into Montreal. And, it's been a kind of a lifelong process in a way. There was a point where when I was around high school age, I was briefly seduced by Zionism in the sense that it was kind of an underdog mentality. We're going to defend whatever, reading Leon Uris, Exodus, that kind of bullshit. And then I had actually a good friend in high school who dissuaded me ultimately of those notions. He would argue with me about that. And then when I was at University of Toronto, I did a little stupid first year political science assignment that was democratic assessments. And I just said, I'll do my own research. I'll assess Israel. And it was that's all I had to do. Do a little of my own research. It was okay, wow, very clear what's going on here. And this was back in 2002, right? So since then, there's certainly been no ambiguity in my mind. But honestly, I have to say that I wasn't that outspoken on this particular issue, because I was aware of Steve Saleta and all the other stories of people who, especially in the academy, that this was a third rail issue, right? And I guess what I'm just trying to say is so what changed? October 7th, the line was so far across. I had already was kind of pushing more, but that line, it just became so unbearable. Immediately, I mean, right after, it was I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then the speech was obvious. But no, the point I want to end with is actually the place I'm at now that is really different, though, is I cannot stand the anti-Semitism discourse. To me, we are talking about the ultimate white fragility. In 2020, imagine a white person being like that black person with their Black Lives Matter t-shirt, that's really making me feel in danger. That's what this moment is for me. It's exactly the same level of absurdity when we're hearing about anti-Semitism in the context of genocide. And I am done with it. I mean, don't be anti-Semitic, obviously, but I don't want to hear about it as a problem in the context of what problems exist in our world today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, my academic project is rooted in international criminal law. I mean, in your introductions, you talked about this, right? So I study war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and aggression as my actual focus of research, right? So I will say that it has always been not an option for me to not speak my mind generally. I mean, whether that's been about critiques of the Me Too movement a few years ago that people also didn't like, or about genocide in Gaza in particular. And so in terms of to speak or not has not been an option for me personally. I just can't imagine. I can't do that kind of inner divorce, right, between your own kind of sense of self and the way you think and the way you operate in the world. I just don't have, I actually think that would take so much. I've already talked about the way in which our energy is sapped or whatever, but I think that would be, I wouldn't be able to have the energy to continue operating if I had to kind of police those boundaries internally, right? I'm not sure how folks do that, who do it. I think they're not constantly policing boundaries. I think they just make kind of bright line distinctions and then operate kind of outside of the realm of, morality or whatever. I think part of it is, again, though, because of the focus area of my work. Within that area of study, I'm appalled, of course, at the number of genocide scholars or folks who work on international criminal law in this country and elsewhere who are not working on this particular genocide or any other number of crimes, right? Again, whether that's aggression in Iran or broader, patterns of torture and war crimes and abuse or whatever, right? So, but I'm appalled at that. And I'm very aware of who those people are. And I also don't work with them or really have anything to do with them anymore. And it's not like an overt thing. It's just like one has a very clear sense of allegiance, right? So folks who will not only support us personally because the work is so deeply personal that it's not just a question of professional line drawing or whatever, and those who won't. And so that's actually been really helpful, I find, because the communities that are built in the work, whether those are only academic with our colleagues, whether they're with the students that we're supporting, whether we're doing supporting various kinds of activist work in the community, or if we're lawyers and we're doing legal consulting or whatever, right? Like all of these communities that are built and solidified and bring in folks from so many different walks of life around, not to be self-congratulatory, that's not my point at all, but who really are not able to, kind of separate out questions of basic humanity. And I say that not out of an attachment to promoting my own moral high ground here, but just because basic commitments to humanity are the same commitments that underwrite modern international law. Again, not to celebrate international law as such, but to celebrate the emancipatory potential that I think exists within elements of it, and certainly within communities that are discreetly committed to doing that work. And so those community building moments are super edifying and helpful. And, those of us who are in, we know who's not in, and it's a little too late, I think, for folks to kind of jump on to try and get inside that work when they haven't been doing it for 2.5 years. I also have never, like Muhannad, but obviously not the same personal reasons, never been particularly committed to the integrity of institutions as such. Although I will say the degree to which, again, I'm working at a law school, so the degree to which particularly people in law schools, who whether they're working on human rights, whether they're working on protection of constitutional rights domestically, whether they're committed, in their scholarly projects to things like access to justice, or, otherwise committed to social justice, or even indigeneity, whatever, right? All of these areas, I have actually been deeply, deeply shocked and disappointed at the lengths that they will go to pander to the lobby, whether those are for careerist personal reasons or other kinds of reasons. It is actually deeply distressing. But again, I think the lines are quite clear, and those of us who are working in solidarity, in community together, are able to do that now in a way that's deeply personal, that's deeply open, that's deeply trusting, right? And maybe in ways that we wouldn't have been able to before. If that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. I think those are words that I would like to just wrap things up with, because that definitely these last few years have certainly defined many of us, not just in the ways that we re-articulate our commitments to issues like social justice and liberation and humanitarianism, but also it has also created clearer lines between how we operate, and even those who claim an oppositional politics, but who become clearly aligned with more careerist motivations that exemplify the opposite of what we are trying to achieve. And that has been the disenchantment or the disillusionment that I've had, that you've also experienced with people within our fields, but also with the wider institutions that we work within and that we operate in. And if anything, it is moments like this when we can have conversations and share our thoughts and also express our aspirations, whether both hope and despair somehow collide or come together. I think being in community is one of the strongest things that we have right now. So if anything, Muhannad, Heidi, and Nathan, this has been an amazing conversation, and I've learned so much from the three of you. Here on this podcast, we think you're all kick-ass academics who have done amazing work. And we want to ask you if there was a song that you would listen to inspire you or to return to give you sustenance. Could you share that song with us?
I'm not like the most musically inclined person on the planet, unfortunately, but I will say, as a Newfoundlander, I enjoy anything relevant by Kneecap.
Oh my goodness, yes, thank you.
So
I was waiting for someone to say Kneecap.
Raji'een, and
Okay.
it's a combination of many famous Arab artists who produced this song in 2023. Sometime I think in November of 2023 they produced it. Raji'een. Probably listen to it 6, 7, 8, 10 times a day to get me through those days, especially.
I like the song "Dear Sons and Daughters of Hungry Ghosts" by Wolf Parade. So maybe that's a song that I would listen to. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. Thank you so much. Heidi, do you have any last words? Muhannad?
Many years ago, prior to the genocide, I wrote a line in one of my Al Jazeera op-eds: Palestine is a losing cause, but it is not a lost cause. And always keep that in mind. We have suffered many losses. We still do today, but we're not a lost cause. And it is a struggle that the Palestinian people are waging against all the odds in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in the diaspora, and nobody should have an excuse for not joining in.
I couldn't agree more. And I thank you so much for joining me on this podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you
really
again.
Appreciate it. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Somebody wrote to me recently, like totally out of the blue, with a message of solidarity, which is another one of these kind of beautiful moments of community building that are so edifying. And sometimes they really come at the right moments. And they just said, you know, the best way to protect academic freedom is to exercise it.
This podcast series was created for the 10th anniversary of the platform, Everyday Orientalism, and in conversation with its editors, Catherine Bloy and Osama Ali Gad. To find more content and to subscribe, you can visit everydayorientalism.wordpress.com. This podcast was recorded at the University of Toronto. The land that the University of Toronto is on has always been Indigenous land. In 1827, the British King gave over 200,000 acres of Indigenous land appropriated by the Crown to the Anglican bishop to establish King's College. We wish to acknowledge that despite this history of settler colonialism, for thousands of years, this has always been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank our research assistant Sophie Plotkin and our editor and producer Taylor Stark for helping make this podcast possible. Thank you for listening.